Hi folks, in this video I'm going to help clarify some of the features of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a term which has more currency, I think, in the UK than in the US, although it has been gaining a little more attention in the United States in the last few years. The origins of neoliberalism actually lie back in the 1920s and 30s, when it was pioneered by German-speaking economists. And the original project essentially was to steer a middle way between what you might call out and out market freedoms, kind of unfettered market attitude that was considered too dangerous, lacking in regulation and so forth, and liable to produce a kind of chaos. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, overly zealous governmental apparatus that would interfere too much in civil society. That was the original vision of so-called Ordo liberalism, neoliberalism, from the 1920s among German thinkers. While there are some affiliations with that, neoliberalism, as it's going to be described in this context, and we're going to be looking at David Harvey's work on the origins of contemporary neoliberalism. Contemporary neoliberalism is really an offshoot of theoretically the work of Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian economist whose main works were published in the 1940s through the 1960s. And then even more immediately the work of Milton Friedman, who more than anyone else worked to put neoliberalism at the front of the political agenda in the 1980s. Historically, it's relatively easy to pinpoint the dates when neoliberalism became the dominant form of political thinking and organization in states such as the US and the UK, and that was the early 1980s. It was the period, the 1980s, dominated by the two terms of Ronald Reagan in the US and the three terms of Margaret Thatcher in the UK, beginning with her first election victory in 1979. Reagan came to power in 1980. However, there are earlier experiments, as it were, with neoliberalism, and those were conducted under the auspices of the United States in South America, particularly in Chile, in the 1970s. So what I set out to do here is explain some of the origins, some of the elements that gave rise to neoliberalism, and also some of the salient features of neoliberalism. I should say as well, an important thing to add at the beginning, that neoliberalism remains the dominant political paradigm. There's some sense that perhaps we're reaching a crisis in neoliberalism, or have been perhaps in the last 6 to 12 years. It depends which kind of time frame you take. Certainly since 2008, when the global financial crisis occurred, there have been a series of shockwaves that have given rise both to economic issues, but also to arguably new political formations. Most obviously in the latter, the rise of populism, particularly, most obviously in the United States in 2016 when Trump won the election. In my own native country of the United Kingdom, in the same year, in June of 2016, when the British people voted to leave the European Union, was also considered to be largely driven by so-called populist sentiments. Neoliberal government classically is more technocratic than populist. That is to say, it tends to think of the economy as a sort of, if you like, a specialized machine that only experts can operate. Although, as we'll see, part of neoliberalism's rhetorical appeal is to bring about an identification between personal values and economic values. But we'll explore those in the slides to come. Now, all of these slides are simply quotations from the reading, from the prescribed reading from David Harvey, from his Brief History of Neoliberalism, which came out in 2005, so 3 years before the financial crisis of 2008 and then the ensuing so-called Great Recession. In the previous lecture, we looked at Harvey's later book, 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism. So Harvey has written a lot both before and after the financial crisis of 2008, much of which focuses on neoliberal capitalism. In fact, that's the invariable focus of Harvey's most recent work in the last 15 or so years. So let's dive in here and explore some of the features of neoliberalism. And here, Harvey is both characterizing neoliberalism and also giving an account, or his account, of what gave rise to neoliberalism and what the purpose, if you like, what the essential functions of neoliberalism are. Now, this is a curiously difficult task for one principal reason, and that reason is that neoliberalism has now been dominant for 2 generations. As I say, it goes back as an overt political formation to the early 1980s. So it's been around now for over 4 decades, and it's become, in a sense, so unquestioned in many ways, both personally and politically, that sometimes it can be hard to see the wood for the trees. It's hard to appreciate, in a sense, the uniqueness and in many ways the strangeness of neoliberalism, particularly for those who have no living memory preceding the 1980s or the 1990s. So when I teach this in the classroom, my experience is that among younger learners, so in their early 20s, there is a sort of sense of recognition when we get into this, a sort of aha moment when people realize, oh yes, this is the thing that we live with. That is why our politics is the way it is. So hopefully this comes alive for you as we're going through the slides here, and I offer a further elucidation, and also obviously, as always, in conjunction with the readings. But let's turn to some of the Harvey quotes here. And again, I'm quoting always from his Brief History of Neoliberalism. So one of the things at the outset that Harvey accentuates is the role that freedom and liberty play in the rhetoric of neoliberalism. Now, freedom, of course, is a key notion, both in ethics and in politics, and certainly in what we refer to as the Western tradition of philosophy. It's been really dominant from the time of Plato and Aristotle onwards. but there's a particular configuration, a particular concept of liberty or freedom that's at work in neoliberalism. So that's the task at hand. How does neoliberalism characterize liberty? Why does it do it that way? And what are the restrictions, in a sense? What other notions of liberty are, in a sense, excluded in favor of the neoliberal conceptualization of liberty? All of these are key questions to ask. So here's our initial quote here from the Harvey text, and he writes, "The founding figures of neoliberal thought took political ideals of human dignity and individual freedom as fundamental, as the, quote, central values of civilization. In so doing, they chose wisely, for these are indeed compelling and seductive ideals. These values they held were threatened not only by fascism, dictatorships, and communism, but by all forms of state intervention that substituted collective judgments for those of individuals free to choose." So you already get a taste there for the specific constitution of liberty in neoliberalism. Now, if you look at this quote at first glance, there might seem to be nothing particularly insightful going on here. And again, I think, as we'll see throughout this video lecture, this is because 4 decades of neoliberalism have made this type of thinking for our types of societies second nature, almost self-evident. But the thing to note, and the thing that Harvey is drawing attention to here, is the prioritization of individual over collective liberty. If we ask philosophically how and why that's justifiable, it's hard to give a specific answer. Certainly in liberalism, so the kind of political formation that was advocated for and outlined by the likes of John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, individual liberty is the key value that needs to be protected. If we think of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, arguably the most influential text on the question of freedom written in the 19th century, then for Mill, the task is to defend individual liberty from 2 main threats. The first threat is the one of government, if you like, interfering with the individual's life through making certain things illegal, so forth, censorship, so forth. The other is society, civil society. So similarly, suppressing free speech, but also suppressing what John Stuart Mill called experiments of living, by which he simply means the liberties that he feels should be given to sets of individuals to live in whichever way they want, short of harming anyone else. So even in classic liberalism in the 19th century, which is distinct from 20th century neoliberalism, you already have this constitution of liberty that very much focuses on the rights of the individual over and against the power of the state and the power of society to curtail the liberty of the individual. Now, the way in which this is modified in neoliberalism, to make a general statement, is that it's primarily market consumer freedoms that are at the center of neoliberalism's concerns. So it's specifically taking the state as a potential threat to market consumer-based liberties, that is at the center of neoliberalism's concerns. So out of that, you get this sense, well, the state, certainly the state can have rules of fair play when it comes to economic transactions and a certain level of consumer protection and so on. But the state should not be an economic player itself, or at least it should minimize that role. Now, again, you can see precursors to this in the likes in classical liberalism, in John Stuart Mill's liberalism. An example of this would be that Mill, very much a progressive, very much in favor of state-funded general education. When Mill was writing this in the 1860s in England, that didn't exist. There was an Education Act, but it didn't come about until 1870, and it was still quite a while after that before general education was actually made available to young people in England and the United Kingdom more generally. But for John Stuart Mill, it's important that the state fund general education, but equally important that the state not manage general education. And Mill's concern about that was really, he wanted to make sure that the state didn't run education so that it wouldn't start to indoctrinate young people. So it was a kind of a concern, if you like, about intellectual freedom. But there's, so his concern is not an economic one. However, when it comes to neoliberalism now and not classic liberalism, the concern is distinct. Well, it's added to and the emphasis has changed. So a neoliberal might also be concerned about the intellectual impact of state schools, that they might create too much uniformity of thinking and so forth. But the primary focus in a neoliberal critique of state education will be around the consumer mechanism. That is to say, neoliberals want to, from their perspective, emancipate caregivers or parents of young learners and give them free market choices. So out of that comes, for example, Milton Friedman's, going back to the 1960s now, but Milton Friedman's preferred reform method for state-funded education is a voucher system, where every American household will be given a certain set amount of money in the form of a voucher that could be used exclusively for education. And they could then go out into the open market, potentially supplement that voucher value with their own money, and then go to any, in a sense, licensed and registered education provider. And that would, in a sense, work to counter both Mill's concern about state-run schools potentially indoctrinating students or creating a uniformity of thinking rather than a diversity of thinking, but at the same time emancipate, and this is the most crucial element of the neoliberal reform mind, would be to emancipate the parents as consumers. So the state goes from providing the service itself without any choice. And typically state schools are neighborhood schools, and the parents have to send their kids to the neighborhood school, and allow parents the transactional economic freedom to choose whichever education provider they want to, essentially based on the fee and the convenience to the consumers, which in this case are, in the first instance, the parents, and in the second instance, the student. Now, what we've ended up with, and I think this is a good case history in the impact of neoliberalism, voucher systems tended to come to grief over state money being used for church schools, for religiously founded schools, interestingly. because of the idea of the separation of church and state, that the state can't favor any form of religious confession. Often there have been challenges to the constitutionality of using state funds, in this, say, in a voucher form, for a church-based or founded school. So partly for that reason, partly for other reasons, and because of the polemics around schooling, people tend to have very strong feelings about the way the school system is organized, so a certain amount of opposition against the voucher systems and other ways of reorganizing schools. Ultimately, the sort of neoliberal reform movement shifted to another model, and that model is the charter school. And the charter schools have been remarkably successful in the last 15 to 20 years. In some cases, charter schools really dominate the school system in certain municipalities. And if you're interested in this particular topic, I think it is a good case history. You could do a lot worse than read Diane Ravitch's, that's R-A-V-I-T-C-H, Ravitch. Diane Ravitch's The Death and Life of the Great American School System, which I believe came out around about 2010. So that's Diane Ravitch, the Death and Life of the Great American School System. Ravitch is a great critic of the charter school system and reform movement. However, you can just read her history of the charter school movement and obviously come to your own conclusions. Anyway, that was just taking the initial idea of neoliberalism, the idea that it's all about the freedom, economic freedom to choose, and the championing of individualism, and the positioning of freedom, the concern with freedom and liberty in relation to individual liberty and freedom. So there's a question mark there about collective expressions of collective freedom, which I'll come back to. Now, what's striking to Harvey is that the putting the concern with liberty and freedom in the foreground of political life in the form of neoliberalism has seemingly put it in a good position to morally justify interventionary wars. Certainly from the Gulf Wars through the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, under neoliberalism, the United States has justified really a fairly constant front of interventionary war, primarily in the Middle East. So Harvey writes, when all the other reasons for engaging in a preemptive war against Iraq were proven wanting, the President Bush Jr. at the time, President appealed to the idea that the freedom conferred on Iraq was in and of itself an adequate justification for the war. The Iraqis were free, and that was all that really mattered. So this idea that freedom is a Western value and that essentially it can be exported through force of arms. The idea that you can rescue another people from their own seemingly despotic government. Now, the argument here is not, in this case in Iraq, that Saddam Hussein wasn't a vicious dictator, but the point is, and it's a very difficult point, a very tricky point in international politics, that one nation state has, in a sense, the moral right to emancipate a people, a foreign people, against their own government. Now, you can just imagine the world if that were to be a generalized principle. Now, of course, it helps if you have the most effective military in the world to, as it were, carry out the emancipation. If a less powerful country were to have such an idea, presumably they wouldn't have the means to bring it about. But there's a bit of a tightrope walk that happens here in international politics. And I would say as well, in the day-to-day of political back and forth, quite a lot of hypocrisy, because one and the same country can defend the right of another nation to manage its own domestic affairs, and at the same time say, well, in this case, it doesn't apply. So it's, in some ways, it's a dangerous card to play when you talk about liberating other nations against their own governments. I mean, in effect, that's a sort of, if you like, a revolution from without. And that's certainly a difficult proposition, and can easily run against international law. But there are some paradoxes here that we'll actually come back to when we look at, in the second half of this class, when we look at issues of sovereignty and the people and so forth. Where and how a government gains its legitimacy is a profound political problem. So more specifically, Harvey again is writing about the invasion of Iraq roughly 2 decades ago. He writes the following: the Bush administration's answer to this question was spelled out on the 19th of September 2003, when Paul Bremer, head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, promulgated 4 orders that included, quote, the full privatization of public enterprises, full ownership rights by foreign firms of Iraqi businesses, full repatriation of foreign profits, the opening of Iraq's banks to foreign control, national treatment for foreign companies, and the elimination of nearly all trade barriers. Now, what Harvey's getting at here, of course, is that underlying the high-minded ideals of liberating a people against a despotic and hated ruler was the somewhat less glorious concern of opening up Iraq to and its natural resources to exploitation by foreign-owned companies. So, in other words, there's very much a sort of an economic driving motive here. Let's, if you like, let's allow the leading corporations to come in and exploit essentially the local economy and draw profit from some of the local infrastructure and resources. And Harvey's point would be that these are you can take your pick as to which you think is the real motivation for an intervention such as the invasion of Iraq. The reason given at the time of invasion was that Saddam Hussein perhaps possessed the infamous weapons of mass destruction, which proved to be non-forthcoming after the invasion. And I can remember distinctly after the invasion, there was this sense that, well, these weapons are going to be found. And then there was a sense, well, maybe they got smuggled out of the country at the last minute. But certainly in the case of the UK, the intelligence reports were actually doctored in order to make the parliamentary case more convincing. And that became a rather infamous incident in UK politics. There was much talk at the time of a so-called smoking gun, the idea that, well, Saddam Hussein must have these weapons of mass destruction, which proved to be impossible to find. So again, Harvey's analysis of neoliberalism in practice is very much an effort to unmask the economic motives of what are often given as sort of moral and political interventions. So the next title I give the next slide, rather, I give the title Free Market Fundamentalism. And this gets us into the heart of neoliberalism. It's a rather long quote, so bear with me. Harvey writes, the assumption that individual freedoms are guaranteed by freedom of the market and of trade is a cardinal feature of neoliberal thinking. And it has long dominated the US stance towards the rest of the world. What the US evidently sought to impose by main force on Iraq was a state apparatus whose fundamental mission was to facilitate conditions for profitable capital accumulation on the part of both domestic and foreign capital. I call this kind of state apparatus a neoliberal state. The freedoms it embodies reflect the interests of private property owners, businesses, multinational corporations, and financial capital. From my perspective, it's hard to argue against this perspective that Harvey is putting forward. The rise in political power of the biggest capitalist corporations, both domestically and also internationally, I think is really hard to counter. And, you know, Harvey's point here is that, well, there might be many different reasons to intervene in an international, in an international context. The reason given, remember, was that 2 years before there'd been the attack on the Twin Towers by, led and masterminded by Al-Qaeda. And so the immediate reason given for invading Iraq and Afghanistan before it was self-defense. Now, there's issues around international law and conventions and so forth as to whether you can carry out a preemptive invasion in order to stave off further attacks, which may or may not occur. But that was the reason that, in a sense, was given at the time. However, again, what Harvey wants to point out is that, well, you know, whatever the merits of that argument, whatever the merits of the kind of weaponry that Saddam Hussein had at the time, it's certainly true that after the point of invasion, the main drive was to render Iraq and its the region in which it finds itself open for business, and particularly open for foreign ownership. And this occurs under neoliberal thinking constantly. So what neoliberalism doesn't like is a large sovereign state that has large state enterprises. And so it likes to go into countries, whether peaceably or through force, and to essentially asset strip those nation states. And so there's clearly, for Harvey, and I think accurately, there's a predatory impulse in international politics under neoliberalism that has very little, if anything, to do with emancipating people. Now, it's important to understand, both historically and also conceptually, that neoliberalism is a certain formation, you might even say a deformation, of what we might call classic liberalism, as it existed roughly from, well, it's hard to date when liberalism came about, certainly as a set of ideas. It goes back to the 17th century at the very latest, probably before that too, but existed as a political reality right through the middle of the 20th century and into the 1960s. It really wasn't until the 1970s that neoliberalism started to supplant it ideologically, and then the 80s it started to supplant it as a sort of political, social reality. So over and against that, what immediately preceded neoliberalism is what Harvey refers to as embedded liberalism. We have a quote that kind of brings that out. So Harvey writes the following. He says, this form of political economic organization is now usually referred to as embedded liberalism, to signal how market processes and entrepreneurial and corporate activities were surrounded by a web of social and political constraints and a regulatory environment that sometimes restrained, but in other instances led the way in economic and industrial strategy. State-led planning, And in some instances, state ownership of key sectors, coal, steel, automobiles, were not uncommon. For example, in Britain, France, and Italy. The neoliberal project is to disembed capital from these constraints. Again, hopefully you can see here in the instance of this quotation how neoliberalism works to essentially divest the state and to limit it, particularly as an economic player. So the idea of nationalizing industries, which, as Harvey points out, was a reality in many European countries in the 20th century, really being opposed in principle to that type of thing. Now, if you ask the question, well, why would the state own a certain enterprise and so forth? Often there are security implications of this. So take the energy sector, for example. Energy supply is so critical to everyday life and to the security of a sovereign state that if it isn't outright owned by the state, then it has to be very tightly regulated. Think of nuclear industry and so forth. Right? The one glaring example in the United States where there's massive amounts of state funding and not altogether a lot of oversight is military spending, which is absolutely massive. It's such a huge proportion of the federal budget. But interestingly, because of its nature, I think military spending doesn't get seen as primarily an economic investment on the part of the state. But whole subsets of the economy rely on the levels of funding to the US military. So it's very interesting, but you wouldn't, certainly after 4 decades of neoliberalism, you wouldn't see anything like that level of state funding for just about any other area. The other area, but it's minuscule compared to the military, would be K-12 education. But the funding for that comes nowhere near to the annual funding for military. But generally speaking, those 2 examples aside, education and military spending, generally speaking, under neoliberalism, state owning an enterprise, directly funding it, is frowned upon. Right? The idea being, the catchword here is that you don't want the government choosing the winners. Right? There's an example, I think, in the Obama administration when Obama was very much pushing solar panels, but wanted to, as it were, prior to Trump, bring the jobs home. And that was a largely unsuccessful attempt to have the state put money into a particular industry, largely undermined by the fact that China was very readily able to outcompete the United States in terms of unit price for a whole bunch of complicated reasons. It's also important to remember, I think I mentioned this in the previous video lecture, that according to WTO rules, nation states are not allowed to favor their own domestic industry with subsidies and so forth. A counterexample to that is agriculture, where the United States gets away with providing billions and billions in subsidies to farmers. That has to do with food security and particularly the focus on the great commodity crops, most obviously corn. It's a slightly different story, but again, that to some degree is a hangover from the 1970s. And many countries argue constantly that the agricultural subsidies in the United States and the European Union should be abolished. The front of the queue there is usually Australia. So much for the contrast between embedded liberalism and neoliberalism. Let's move on. Now, I call the title here is The Reassertion of Ruling Class Power. So far, we've talked about, in a sense, the features of neoliberalism, according to Harvey. But what is the purpose? What is the end game? What is the motive for the transition to neoliberalism. I've mentioned before, Harvey is a self-professed Marxist, and so he follows Marx's idea that really to understand politics, you have to get to grips with class conflict. And under capitalism, according to Marx, there are all class distinctions are resolved into two major classes, the bourgeoisie or the property owners, and the proletariat, or those who by and large just have their labor to sell. And against that backdrop, Harvey sees the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s as a reassertion of ruling class power. Let's see how he puts this in this quote here. He writes, "To have a stable share of an increasing pie is one thing, but when growth collapsed in the 1970s, when real interest rates went negative and paltry dividends and profits were the norm, then upper classes everywhere felt threatened. In the US, the control of wealth as opposed to income by the top 1% of the population had remained fairly stable throughout the 20th century. But in the 1970s, it plunged precipitously." He has a graph for this in the text. "As asset values, stocks, property, savings collapsed. The upper classes had to move decisively if they were to protect themselves from political and economic annihilation." So this has to do with the history of 50 years ago. The key event was the oil crisis of 1973, and the refusal of OPEC, the central bodies, nation states that owned oil primarily in the Middle East, to release more oil to make that available to the world and to ease up on the prices. And instead, they ration the supply of oil, and that is deemed as having kicked off a world recession, which continued through into the early 1980s. So a sort of decade-long global recession. And as Harvey points out, the real threat here was to the so-called 1%, who is no longer bringing in a level of money that fitted it to its traditional and expected role in society. So, in effect, neoliberalism then is seen as a reaction against dwindling profits and among the wealthy elite to, in a sense, regain the momentum, push back against economic inequality. And for the likes of Harvey, that's why we've ended up 40, 50 years down the line with absolutely rampant economic inequality and the sort of the rise of the billionaire class with no obvious end in sight. So with that, then, the next slide, inequality on the rise. Harvey writes, after the implementation of neoliberal policies in the late 1970s, the share of national income of the top 1% of income earners in the US soared to reach 15%, very close to its pre-Second World War share by the end of the century, by 2000. The top 0.1% of income earners in the US increased their share of the national income from 2% in 1978 to over 6% by 1999, while the ratio of the median compensation of workers to the salaries of CEOs increased from just over 30 to 1 in 1970 to nearly 500 to 1 by 2000. And that last figure is really quite startling. And it really, I think, brings home to us how much within one and the same company, the discrepancy, the sense of distance economically, but also presumably socially then, the bosses, as it were, are carrying off by the end of the 20th century astronomical amounts of money in direct remuneration and bonuses and share options and all the rest of it. And when you get to the very top of the apex here, the 0.1%, that's where the most stark increases are to be found. So this has given rise to, as I said, sort of massive inequalities, and all of this against the backdrop of generally significantly increasing wealth. So there's more money around, if you like, but it's in fewer and fewer hands. And I think, again, in the last decade and a half since the 2008 crisis, we've seen increasing recognition of this, I think, in countries like the United States, and a real sense that the system is really going to break if we don't get to grips with inequality. But we tend to get bogged down in the mechanisms of redistribution. And of course, American politics and politics in most other liberal democracies is extremely riven, extremely divided and divisive. And so we're not seeing the solutions come through. And the final part of the puzzle there, of course, is that over the 40 years of neoliberalism, corporations and governments and parties have become very much enmeshed. So it's easier said than done, even if the odd superstar corporate CEO or whatever says the right things. There's, as a class, the corporate elite doesn't actually want to get to grips with the massive issues of inequality that we face today. So a lot of that is really about the economics of neoliberalism as a sort of economic way of organizing our economy, getting the state to essentially butt out of the economy, except for regulatory purposes. And those regulations should be very business friendly as opposed to worker friendly, because there is that aspect of it too. There's labor law and so forth. But the reforms, kind of economic reforms that neoliberalism has pushed through in the last 4 decades have not been focused on worker protections, but certainly rather in the ability and the potential of corporations to make profits and the CEOs to make massive amounts of money. So moving on in a slightly different direction, under the title Neoliberalism as Political Project. And Harvey writes on that issue. Harvey writes the following. He says, we can therefore interpret neoliberalization either as a utopian project to realize a theoretical design for the reorganization of international capitalism, or as a political project to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. In what follows, I shall argue that the second of these objectives has in practice dominated. So, in other words, a class dominance motive. Neoliberalization has not been very effective in revitalizing global capital accumulation, but it has succeeded remarkably well in restoring, or in some instances, as in Russia and China, creating the power of an economic elite. What Harvey's getting at there is that if you look at sort of increases in GDP and so forth in countries like the United States, the standout decades were really the 50s and the 60s. So if the task of neoliberalism was to reboot the economy and make it much more productive, it's failed. Much stronger growth in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. Certainly China is an exception to that, but then China is obviously a centralized state operation in a way that the United States is not. But where it has succeeded, as Harvey said, is really in sort of redistributing wealth and income, but in an upward direction rather than sharing better. So again, these sort of accumulations of wealth at the top of the pyramid. So again, there's more to be said on the rise of neoliberalism. It's a multifactorial thing. And here's another perspective or another aspect of this. this from Harvey. He writes, there was Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister from the 1980s and early 90s, famously declared, no such thing as society, only individual men and women. And she subsequently added, their families. All forms of social solidarity were to be dissolved in favor of individualism, private property, personal responsibility, and family values. The ideological assault along these lines that flowed from Thatcher's rhetoric was relentless. Economics are the method, she said, but the object is to change the soul. Well, what Harvey's getting into now is essentially the ideological dimension, you could say almost the spiritual dimension of neoliberalism. It wasn't enough for neoliberalism to re-engineer key economic organizations, nor was it enough for to get, as it were, neoliberal governments into power. There had to be a shift in the general public's sense of what politics and the state are all about. So a kind of, as Chomsky would say, a kind of enforced consensus among the voting public that this is what politics has to look like. So this is the kind of hearts and minds aspect of neoliberalism, if you like, the sort of indoctrination aspect of neoliberalism. And it's just as important, and arguably even more important, than the sort of economic changes, the changes in international relations, for the simple reason that neoliberalism here is happening in the context of democracy. So you really have to convince people that the neoliberal paradigm is best suited to their own ends. So further, Harvey writes, Reagan faced down PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, in a lengthy and bitter strike in 1981. This signaled an all-out assault on the powers of organized labor at the very moment when the Volcker-inspired recession was generating high levels of unemployment, 10% or more. But PATCO was more than an ordinary union. It was a white-collar union which had the character of a skilled professional association. It was, therefore, an icon of middle class rather than working class unionism. In the UK, the most prominent dispute with unions came in a much more archetypally working class context, namely the coal miners. There was a long and equally very bitter strike of the miners' unions through 1983 to 1984 in the UK. And that was the iconic struggle against the unions. More generally speaking, a kind of war on unions is another salient feature of neoliberalism. And the rhetoric behind this, and it continues to this day, if you listen to commentators or whatever on mainstream news outlets, you generally hear this kind of sentiment. Namely, that the unions are not really representing the workers, that they illegitimately get in the way between the employees and the employer, that they're fractious, that they like to fight, and so on and so forth. Also, in the United States, much more prominently than, say, the UK, there's a constant deluge of misinformation about unions, such that they're basically controlling the Democratic Party in Washington, and so on and so forth. Certainly, the reality is that since the 1980s, membership of a union, workers that are unionized, has dropped precipitously. In the private sector, unions barely exist in the United States anymore. In the public sector, it's more common. But there are a few unions in the United States which have real clout. The teachers' unions are probably the one exception. And labor law and union law ensures that the actions of unions in the United States are extremely circumscribed. So, for example, it's illegal for unions to coordinate strike action. It's not currently illegal in the UK, for example, but right now, the United Kingdom, in the summer of 2022, is involved already in a lot of strike action, and there's a lot of other unions that are threatening to walk off the job. And the current Conservative government is attempting to draft legislation to roll back some of the freedoms that unions have to coordinate their strike action, presumably modeling that on the labor law and union law in the United States. So part of neoliberalism's attack on the working class and workers more generally is undermining unions and the union movement. I think that's another element that makes Harvey's analysis of neoliberalism as essentially a class conflict, namely the economic elites against the regular workers, gives that more pull, I think, gives that more, makes it more plausible that it's really class conflict that's driving the rise of neoliberalism. So, to continue our account of neoliberalism, we need to look at the sort of point at which its sort of early years, if you like any shift, paradigm shift, the sort of revolutionary nature of the shift is much more evident at the beginning. And then eventually it becomes normalized. And as I said at the very beginning of this video lecture, it becomes naturalized to the point where you don't even recognize it as anything because it's become essentially common sense. So this quote really relates to the beginnings of neoliberalism and often the sort of quite draconian changes that the shift to neoliberalism brought with it. Harvey writes the following: tax breaks on investment effectively subsidized the movement of capital away from the unionized Northeast and Midwest and into the non-union and weakly regulated South and West, talking about the United States here. Finance capital increasingly looked abroad for higher rates of return. Deindustrialization at home and moves to take production abroad became much more common. The market, depicted ideologically as the way to foster competition and innovation, became a vehicle for the consolidation of monopoly power. Corporate taxes were reduced dramatically, and the top personal tax rate was reduced from 70 to 28% in what was billed as, quote, the largest tax cut in history. And so began the momentous shift towards greater social inequality and the restoration of economic power for the upper elites. Now, bearing in mind that Harvey, when he follows the figures, makes very clear that this shift did not bring about some sort of productivity boom to rival what had happened in the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, of course, this rhetoric about reducing taxes on the super rich in order to make the economy more lean and mean, and in order for the so-called job creators to be emancipated, really doesn't pencil out when you look at the detail. And again, this leads Harvey to say, well, you know, these kind of changes are really about the restoration of elite economic power. The immediate thing that such a decrease in tax rate brings about is increases in massive increases in wealth for the upper elites. Tax cuts are generally seen as a way to sell your political party, to sell its program, and so forth. But the real question is who gains from tax breaks and who loses? After all, if you think about what taxation is as a sort of social structure, it's a way of pooling resources and then redeploying those resources for the community at large. Now, it's generally the case, as a generalization, that the poorer you are, the more dependent you are on shared resources, and the wealthier you are, commensurately, the less dependent you are on shared resources. Take an obvious example. Take a library or something along these lines. Well, a library is generally funded through taxpayer funding, and it's there essentially to allow access to certain things such as books and so forth, the sources of information, and to do that in a way that's affordable for the average person. In fact, free, as it were, at the point of use. Now, if you're fabulously wealthy, you might have your own library, or certainly you can buy in as many books as you like. But if you're if you're lacking in resources, then the library offers you a way through the pooling of resources to access books and other media, which is free at the point of use. And then you just, as it were, think about that principle of, in a sense, common ownership applied across the sector in general. Think about schools, again, which United States are largely funded through tax money and so on and so forth. Now, the ideal, the utopia that Harvey talked about a few slides ago of neoliberalism is that there would be no such thing, in a sense, as pooled resources. Nobody would be taxed. Everybody would keep what they get. Now, the problem with that is, well, it still raises the question of how people meet their basic needs. Now, the ideal here is that you keep on slashing taxes. Seemingly, you're putting more money back in people's pockets. But as we saw in the Karl Marx text, that the real question is, what is the spending power that's granted to somebody? You can give somebody more money, but the real question is, what is that? What can they use that money for? How far does it go? So this idea of simply reducing taxes is going to be an improvement, both individually and collectively. It really depends on the consumer power of the individual and the type of common, if you like, welfare that's available to individuals. But this rhetoric and this reality of driving down taxes, both corporation taxes and individual taxes, it's one of those things that through 4 decades of neoliberalism has simply become a self-evident truth. It's always better to reduce taxes. Up through the 1970s, things were seen very differently. It really depends what you're using that tax revenue for. And certainly when there were much higher levels of taxation, there was much greater equality in the United States and also greater economic productivity. So, that's an interesting historical contradiction for neoliberals, who basically say that the only way to keep the kickstart and keep the economy going is to keep on driving down taxes. Historically, in the United States, throughout the 20th century, that doesn't seem to hold true. So this slide, rather, I entitled Neoliberalism as Economic Imperialism. And here's the point from Harvey that I'm trying to capture with that title. He writes, this treatment became standard after what Joseph Stiglitz referred to as a purge of all Keynesian influence from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in 1982. The IMF and the World Bank thereafter became centers for the propagation and enforcement of free market fundamentalism and neoliberal orthodoxy. In return for debt rescheduling, indebted countries were required to implement institutional reforms such as cuts in welfare expenditures, more flexible labor market laws, and privatization. Thus was structural adjustment invented. Mexico was one of the first states drawn into what was going to become a growing column of neoliberal state apparatuses worldwide. So there are 2 things going on here in this quote. The first is, if you like, the sort of intellectual dominance of neoliberalism. The Keynesian idea, which to some extent, since the 2008 financial crisis, has at least gained a little bit of ground back from the neoliberal orthodoxy, is that you want to put as much money in the real economy as possible so that you bolster people's spending power, their consumer money, if you like, their disposable income. And that's the way to keep the economy ticking over. A certain amount of that has been rehabilitated, but it's still not the dominant factor. And as Harvey is pointing out, in the early 1980s, there was a certain sort of orthodoxy created among economic thinkers and economic policy at that point. And he's talking about these very concrete global institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both of which were invented at the immediate after the Second World War, originally to really, as genuinely helpful institutions, as a way for particularly developing economies to, get their economy up and running and to integrate into global markets. But these institutions were essentially refunctioned along neoliberal lines, and this idea of the structural adjustment is, in a sense, the instrument of choice. I.e., the IMF, the World Bank, willing to bail out countries that are essentially bankrupt, but in return for that, right, they require all kinds of economic and social reforms along neoliberal lines, curtailing the power and influence of the state, and so on and so forth, relaxing labor laws to make the hiring and firing of employees easier, selling off state assets, reducing the number of state workers, and so on and so forth. And this is a process that's gone on continuously since the 1980s. A very glaring, more recent example was the restructuring of Greece in the context of the Eurozone crisis in Europe in the second decade of the 21st century. That was a case where Greece actually voted in a left-leaning government under Syriza, but that government was humiliated by having to carry out reforms, economic and social reforms, that were largely driven by Germany and Holland and so forth. So here I kind of coming towards the close of this video lecture. But here we look at some more general features of neoliberalism to try to, fill out the characterization of neoliberalism as a political paradigm. And Harvey writes, the privileges of ownership and management of capitalist enterprises, traditionally separated, fused by paying CEOs or managers and stock options or ownership titles. Stock values rather than production then become the guiding light of economic activity, and as later became apparent with the collapse of companies such as Enron, the speculative temptations that resulted from this could become overwhelming. So the idea is that you don't so much worry about, in a sense, the productivity of the company, what wealth is the company generating, as the value of the company shares on the stock exchange. And any business news, whether it's on the TV or the radio, constantly gives you this sort of running commentary on where the share prices of a particular company lie, and that's seen as an indication as the overall welfare of the company. And Harvey's pointing out that by adding to the CEO's remuneration package stock options, you're kind of you're pushing their interests in a certain direction here, which really has nothing to do with as I say, the actual productivity of the company itself, and therefore opening up an even greater gulf between the workers in a corporation and the CEOs in a corporation. And secondly, Harvey writes, to dramatically reduce the historical gap between money capital earning dividends and interest on the one hand, and production, manufacturing, and merchant capital looking to gain profits on the other. So that's kind of the purpose, right? And for Harvey, this is part of a much bigger sort of structural realignment in the neoliberal economy, that the sort of financial service, everything to do with the financial sector, sort of starts to balloon and bloat up, whereas the manufacturing sector in the leading neoliberal economies is neglected and run down, relatively speaking. And a third point, a wave of innovations occurred in financial services to produce not only far more sophisticated global interconnections, but also new kinds of financial markets based on securitization, derivatives, and all manner of futures trading. Neoliberalization has meant, in short, the financialization of everything. So we go back to the 2008 crisis, the so-called subprime mortgages. Those were securitized, and at the time, even the people that were using were sort of setting these things up acknowledged that they were so bemusingly complex that nobody really knew how the system worked. And the idea is that there's no real collateral, in a sense, behind these loans. And banks, for example, which is why lots of banks were threatening to go bust. Previously, banks had been required to set aside a certain amount of their funds to secure the bank against a so-called run, which is when the people have money in the bank, panic and start to draw their money out. But banks, through a series of regulatory changes, had been allowed to, in a sense, hold no money and to be loaning out way more than was really prudent. And so what you tend to get here is that the so-called real economy is more and more outweighed by the speculative economy. And this becomes quite critical in the sense it becomes more and more chaotic over time. And we had a little bit of a sense of that in the previous video lecture when Harvey was talking about virtual monies, such as Bitcoin and so forth, that have risen in the last decade or so. We kind of touched on this before, but I think it's worth coming back and sort of accentuating this point, the rise of the CEO. Harvey writes the following, that one substantial core of rising class power under neoliberalism lies with the CEOs, the key operators or corporate boards, and the leaders in the financial, legal, and technical apparatuses that surround this inner sanctum of capitalist activity. The power of the actual owners of capital, the stockholders, has, however, been somewhat diminished unless they can gain a sufficiently large voting interest to affect corporate policy. Shareholders have on occasion been built to millions by the operations of the CEOs and their financial advisors. So there's a kind of rise in a sort of CEO class, if you like, of sort of CEO superstars. When we saw earlier, Harvey was quoting how the remuneration to CEOs over the last 40 to 50 years has absolutely skyrocketed relative to the median salary of the people who work in those corporations. And so almost, the top CEOs have almost become like Hollywood stars in their own right. Extremely influential, almost a class of people unto themselves. And I think not only does this point to the sort of, the almost sort of insane economic levels of economic inequality, but also the sense of social division, which maybe played a part in populist sentiment, just as politicians and the political class often seem very divorced from everyday life, the realities of everyday life of the voters. So the corporate class has risen above and isolated itself more and more from the average working class. So it's not just an economic point here, there's a sort of cultural and social point about the fracturing of society brought about deliberately through neoliberalism. In the same direction, Harvey writes this about the dominance of ruling class interests. While this disparate group of individuals embedded in the corporate, financial, trading, and developer worlds do not necessarily conspire as a class, and while there may be frequent tensions between them, they nevertheless possess a certain accordance of interest that generally recognizes the advantages and now some of the dangers to be derived from neoliberalization. They also possess, through organizations like the World Economic Forum at Davos, means of exchanging ideas and of consorting and consulting with political leaders. They exercise immense influence over global affairs and possess a freedom of action that no ordinary citizen possesses. Now, what Harvey's getting at here is to do with the distorting impact of the corporate class. Now, I mentioned a few slides ago that unions have been systematically derided and denigrated as outside influences, illegitimate outside influences over, particularly in the US, the Democratic Party. The idea that shadowy unions are kind of in charge of everything. Now, while there might have been something to that in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, it'd be very hard to argue that in the United States in 2022, that somehow unions and union bosses are calling the shots in Washington, D.C. It would, however, be quite plausible to make that claim in relation to the corporate elite. As Harvey points out, they have their own forums, such as the World Economic Forum. But also above and beyond that, corporate leaders can gain much more easy access to high-level politicians than any other organizations or pressure groups, environmental, economic, social, cultural, you name it, let alone the average citizen. So there's a huge question here about the democratic legitimacy of neoliberalism and the way that the elite corporate class gets to have more and more outsized influence over our politics. There's no democratic accountability to the corporate class, even though they often put themselves forward as having a natural right to exert political influence. But that's something I think well worth questioning. So that's the end of this slideshow, folks. I hope that in the course of it, you've gained more insight into the origins and the nature of neoliberalism, and that elaborating on Harvey's account, as I've done, giving examples and so on and so forth, has helped create a more concrete picture of what neoliberalism is. We won't leave behind this theme, although we won't tackle it quite as directly as I'm doing in this particular video lecture. Where we'll go with this later in the second half of this class is come back to this question of democracy. Neoliberalism certainly makes the claim that the sort of economic freedoms which are championed are also the cornerstones of a vibrant democracy. The idea being that the more the state interferes in the economy, the less truly democratic it's going to be. But it's widely held that at this point now, when we're 5 decades in, or in the 5th decade of neoliberals' experiment in as the dominant paradigm, that actually democracy is really not in very good shape. And the question there is, to what degree the kind of economic and social reforms that have been brought in by neoliberalism have actually, over time, contributed to this undermining of the health of our democracies. We'll pick up that question in our future video lectures.